I thought maybe I could preface some of my remarks by the situation in the Western world in general and in here in North America, maybe the United States in particular. I don't know whether we had pre-existing problems of this magnitude in the West and the terrible year of 2020 set them off. Maybe we could have survived the plague and maybe even our first national quarantines we saw in Western society since the medieval period, or maybe even in the Great Plague, the Spanish flu of 1918 didn't do quite like the damage that these quarantines have done. And we had a self-induced recession throughout the Western world. Here in the United States, we had the George Floyd death and 120 days of looting, rioting, arson, $2 billion in damage, 28 people killed, 14,000 people arrested, the vast majority of them released without charges. And we had an election year in the United States where, for the first time in history, a vast majority did not vote on election day. We had 102 million ballots that were sent in, or early balloting, 63%. And the closest we had come was 2016 with a mere 40%. So these were all new phenomenon. And then we get into the January 6th demonstration and riot. And in addition to that, we had the controversial nature of Trump, the person, Trump's personality. And then we had this strange campaign. I don't think we'd ever seen anything in the United States since, historical reports of how McKinley or other 19th century politicians campaigned from their front porch. Joe Biden was a virtual candidate. We never really got to know him. He was secluded in isolation, as it were. And we would have been able to describe one or two or three of those phenomenon, but not all of them together. They were force multipliers of themselves. And the net result is that here in the United States, 9 months into this new administration, we're at a radical juncture that I don't think that we've seen. At the first 2 or 3 months, people that were independents and neither Republican or Democrat thought that they had voted, and he did win the popular vote, so they thought they had voted for old Joe Biden from Scranton. They were aware that he had become a vessel of respectability, as it were, to carry a radical agenda forward. That would be the agenda of Elizabeth Warren or Bernie Sanders, or what we call here in the United States the Squad. And you know the issues. It's a mandatory New Green Deal, or critical racial theory, or the new monetary theory, which we printed $5 trillion in the last 2 months. We're up to over $30 trillion in aggregate national debt. Or it's this new foreign policy where our self-criticism at home filters abroad, and we've lost confidence in our ability to play the singular role that we used to. And that means we've lost, pretty much after the humiliation and skedaddle from Afghanistan, we've lost deterrence. So all of these issues were not popular, but Joe Biden still went through the motions that he was immoderate. And we had been warned by the left itself in very candid terms what was going to ensue. Hillary Clinton said during the COVID crisis, we never want to let a crisis go to waste. She was reverberating what her former associate Ron Emanuel had said in 2008 about the financial meltdown that ushered in Obamacare. And she was saying, this is our chance for single-payer health care. Gavin Newsom was so bold to say to people, basically under the guise of his lockdown, he thought it gave us a chance to have a more progressive capitalism, almost mimicking word for word what Klaus Schwab of the Great Reset group at the Davos had said, that under this crisis, there was a chance for countries basically to give up some of their sovereignty and have a world collective that would set international corporate rates. So we were prepared that this series of disasters would create enough conundrum that agendas that otherwise would have never been reified, they did not have 50% support, would be pushed in, and Biden would be the vessel that would carry them across the finish line. And that's what happened. What nobody thought would happen is what ensued next. Here we are 9 months out, and Joe Biden is polling about 37, 36% popularity. The individual policies that he advanced, while they never had 50% support, they did not cause commiserate controversy because people were willing to give Joe Biden, who was a familiar totem for 40 years in Washington. But that's all over now. He's down at 36%. The policies on the border, the policies abroad, the policies on economic and fiscal management, they poll in the low 30s. Joe Biden is not a compensatory force for his agendas. He's a force multiplier now of his unpopularity. The second thing is that while people were aware that Joe Biden had cognitive challenges, and I think that's a euphemism for being addled or muddled, he was not a normal 78. We all know people in their 90s who are sharp as a tack. He had problems, and those problems were hushed up by the media or suppressed by political activists in the Democratic Party. But what we didn't expect, we being Americans, I think some of us did, but he was an angry muddled and an angry befuddled. And so when he does a rare press conference, he gets angry. He says things that are just absurdly untrue, that no one was vaxxed until he was president, or he created the vaccination program, or anybody that wants to get out of Kabul just goes to the airport and goes, or he's been to the border. He's never been to the border. And on and on and on. And then when pressed on, he gets very angry. And he tends to kind of, in reductionist fashion, just mention Donald Trump. He's like he's obsessed with him. It's Donald Trump, Donald Trump, Donald Trump. And so that has been a contributory to his unpopularity. But what's more important, I think, is that we're at the stage now where we're beyond these policies being unpopular or Joe Biden himself being controversial. There's two issues in America now, and they're going to affect, I think, people in Canada and elsewhere in the Western world, and indeed the world at large. One is that the United States, for the first time in memory, is starting to face existential challenges that transcend politics and affect the daily lives of people. And let me be a little bit more specific. If you're an independent, if you have no party affiliation, Joe Biden among you has gone from +8 to -7. Democrats, about a third of Democrats are worried. Not that they don't like power and holding it. They control both houses of Congress and the presidency. But what they're worried about is, for the first time, the shelves in American stores are starting to look like those in Venezuela or Cuba. We're a first world country that's supply chain is starting to regress to third world status. If you fly over Los Angeles, as I did this week, you look out as far as you can see on the horizon, there are container ships. And the port of Los Angeles at Long Beach looks like it's dysfunctional from the air. Part of it is that there's enormous demand fed by this continual printing of money. Part of it is that we are paying people such rich stipends under the guise of COVID that they have lost their incentive to work, or at least to work a full day under a regular payroll. They might want to work stealthily for cash for a few hours to supplement their government check. But we're eroding the work ethic as we knew it, and partly because from the moment this administration entered, they announced quite proudly and boldly, partly on the cue of, as I said, Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, or AOC, that they were going to raise capital gains taxes. They were going to raise income taxes. They were going to raise estate taxes. They were going to curb deductions. They were going to hector and jawbone and lecture and sermonize to frackers and horizontal drillers and business people. So at the very time national demand was recalibrating after the slow reopening of the economy, they were subsidizing people not to get into the labor force to meet that demand, and they were discouraging producers and small businesses and corporations to take the sort of risk that was necessary to ramp up to meet that demand. So it was an artificially induced shortage, and now people, when you drive down the freeways in America, there's signs on cars, help wanted. And there used to be, a logo of a company or a corporation, but now they say now hiring, workers wanted. And there's a shortage of it. We're warned we're not going to have a normal Christmas. Here in California, we are used to high prices because of all these regulations and green mandates, but not $5 and $6 a gallon. And when people look at the shortages, sometimes we have a limit of $100. They think this is artificially induced. As one person said to me, am I a stranger in a strange land? A year ago, we were the largest natural gas and oil producer in the world. But if you cut down production by over 2 million barrels a day by intent, and you hector horizontal drillers and frackers that their days are numbered, and you cancel the pipelines and you no longer integrate with additional sources of energy, such as found in Canada, which we had green lighted, and you put all new federal leases and excuse me. And in addition to that, you cancel the Anwar field, then anyway, I'm sorry, I saw a note. If you're doing all that, you're going to discourage production. If discouraging production, you're going to have high gas prices, and people are very angry at that. Second, when they look at the border, it's not a question any longer of illegal immigration and 22 million people living in the United States who have crossed the border as their first act illegally, and as their second act residing here illegally, or as their third act finding some type of false documentation to excuse Act 1 and 2. We have no border. It doesn't exist. It's a construct. We have 2 million people slated to cross the American border in the next fiscal year. So what I'm getting at is these are new phenomena we've never seen before. The United States military, for the first time in 50 years, not since helicopters left the roof of our embassy in Saigon, has suffered such a humiliating defeat. We left somewhere around 50 to 80 billion dollars of military equipment. And if you add the training involved in using those, it could be higher. And we left them in the hands of terrorists. And what did that figure represent? It represented about 80% of all the money that the United States has provided Israel in 80% of its existence. Since about 1965, all of the money we've given Israel, we gave to terrorists in Afghanistan. Or we are in a big controversy here. Can we afford to buy 10 F-35s? They're so expensive. We could have bought 900 of them for the amount of military equipment we abandoned. We are in great controversy over the Gerald Ford, our 11th aircraft carrier, $13 billion for this huge ship. We could have bought 6 of them for the price. So it's giving you some kind of idea of the magnitude of that disaster. And that's well beyond and transcends the question that we simply abandon our close allies and we skedaddled. And so when you add all of these things together, people are saying these are not political controversies. These are existential issues. Am I going to be able to buy things in the store for the first time? Is the United States safe? Will Taiwan be absorbed because of the loss of deterrence? Can I hunt around town as my parents or grandparents told me they used to do in the 70s to find affordable gas? Will we have energy this winter to warm because there's natural gas is slated to double in price? Do we know any of these people that are coming across the border? 2 million of them. Are they going to do what? Overtax social services? Orthodox Democratic communities along the border are now starting to flip and become conservative because they do not want this influx in their communities. We have a mandate, as you do, about vaccination, but it is incoherent. And so people are saying to themselves, 100 million of them have had COVID. And there was ample scientific studies that suggest, at least for a while, that naturally acquired immunity gives you a level of antibodies that is commensurate with or superior to a vaccination's immunity. And yet they're not allowed to go to restaurants. If they're soldiers, they're going to be discharged. If they're federal workers, they're going to be fired. And no one, in particular Dr. Anthony Fauci, can say, why don't we just have certificates that show antibody levels or some mechanism to allow people who suffered through COVID and have acquired immunity to have the same status as those who were vaccinated? So it's these issues that are starting to really question the liberty and freedom and the viability of this country. And I'm not trying to exaggerate. It's an entirely new experience for an entire generation of people. When we look toward people for answers, we see a strange phenomenon again. We have the unelected. These are people in Washington, in the bureaucracy, in administrative state, deep state, permanent government, whatever term we want to call the unelected, who are exercising legislative, judicial, and executive power all within one person. I'll give you a few examples. We have Dr. Anthony Fauci. He has said that we did not need masks. He has said that we should all wear one mask. He said that if you want to wear two, better yet. Early on, he said, we'll be out of this when we get 60% herd immunity. We'll be out of this when we get 70% herd immunity. We'll be out of it when we get 80 and 90. Why is he saying this? Because he believes in the Platonic noble lie that we are stupid, we citizens, and therefore if we want to get vaxxed, he has to scare us to get a higher level of herd immunity, or he doesn't want us to go out and buy masks, and he says make a run on the availability of protective equipment for healthcare workers. Or we have had him under oath to Congress swear that there was no money in the United States given, routed through Echo Health Alliance to the Wuhan lab to enhance gain of function viral engineering. He's sworn that under oath, and now we know that the head of the CDC, NIH, and other superiors to Fauci, or at least parallel medical grandees, have now contradicted him. We look at General Milley for reassurance, what happened in Afghanistan, what is going on, and we find out that the chairman of the Joint Chiefs has been investigating, along with the Secretary of Defense, whether we have white supremacists with no evidence. We don't have any, nobody's said a report, these people are white supremacists, this brigade, that battalion, this division is nothing. All we know, if we want to foolishly emphasize race, is that white males die in double their numbers in Afghanistan and Iraq. About 75% of the fatalities in both of those wars were white male Americans, the very rubric that are now being smeared as potentially suspect terrorists. And I don't mean that lightly. School board members were recently called domestic terrorists and objects of investigation, supposedly by the FBI. So when we're looking at these leaders, we're not reassured. General Milley has told us that he's contacted his counterpart in the People's Liberation Army in China to warn him should a preemptory aggression be ordered by Donald Trump when Donald Trump was president. Although Donald Trump, whatever one wants to say about him, he was the first president in memory who did not inaugurate an offensive operation. There was no Libya, there was no Iraq, there was no Afghanistan. And so that was striking. We've had our head of the CIA, John Brennan, in the past, James Clapper, the director of national intelligence. We've had James Comey either say under oath they cannot remember 245 times, or that they told the Congress a lie, but it was the least untruthful version that they gave, or they simply couldn't remember and they won't remember, or they denied something they later had to retract. And what I'm getting at is that what causes all of this turmoil and this angst and these crises? And I think the way to look at it is that there were existential problems in the Western world, and these terrible events in succession in 2020 and 2021 were igniters. They ignited what this pre-existing IED, and now we've seen that it's not assured. There's no deity that says you're the United States, you're Westerners, you deserve this level of affluence and leisure, and the very stuff of life is in question. But that then leaves the essence of what I wanted to talk and finish about, and that is simply uh, how did that happen? What happened to the citizen? Why weren't citizens holding their elected officials accountable? How did we get 2 million people in the federal government exercising judge, jury, executioner power over us? And I think the answer to that is there were organic forces coming naturally from that have been with us across time and space since antiquity, and we did not address them. One is you have to have a middle class that's viable for a constitutional society and to guarantee liberty and freedom among the citizens. And yet, by every barometer, for the last 40 years, the American middle class has lost real wages. Its household income adjusted for inflation has either been static or in decline. Students in America in the aggregate owe $1.7 trillion in student loans. And many of them got very little for being indebted at per capita about $30,000. By that, I mean their social science degrees or their dash studies degrees, ethnic studies, feminist studies, racial studies, leisure studies, peace studies, green studies, whatever they were, did not give them the tools to be competitive in the workplace. So we had the worst of both worlds. We have an entire generation that's indebted, and we have an overeducated glut of people that have credentials or letters after their name, but they're really not competitive in the workplace because they did not pick up the skills for all of that borrowed money. And historically, as you know, the most dangerous group of people are those who feel they're entitled by their degree or their place in society or the fact they were at a university, and yet society does not compensate them. There's no job for them. And so that's part of our problem. And it's rippled throughout the middle class. The age when people are getting married, and this is, I think, true in Canada as well, in the United States has gone from just 20 years ago, about 26 to 29. The age when people have their first child has gone from about 29 to 32. The number of children per family has gone just in 20 years from 2.2 down to 1.7. The age and the percentage of people the age at which you buy a house and the percentage of people who do buy houses is dropping. So we're creating just what Alexis de Tocqueville worried and warned people about, and that was the creation of a subsidized, dependent, but also impotent and inert, prolonged adolescent. People who in their 20s and 30s and 40s have delayed things they should have been doing traditionally in their early 20s. We're not having a confident, self-reliant, economically autonomous citizen of the stuff that makes up democracies. The type of people who say to the wealthy, we are in larger numbers than you, we are aware, we combine muscular labor with intellectual thought, and we're not going to let you use your influence, Mark Zuckerberg, to pour $400 million into selected precincts. Or Michael Bloomberg, we don't like the idea that you're putting $20 billion into startup companies in communist China, many of them controlled by the communist government. Or we don't believe you, Bill Gates, when you say that the Chinese have been a model in their reaction to the COVID virus. We believe they were the originators and spreaders of it. That's what a middle class can do. And when Merrick Garland then comes before Congress, we have a few people left that are confident their constituencies will hold them accountable if they hold Merrick Garland accountable. And so he testified yesterday that he, in fact, had no evidence that any parent was a member of some domestic terrorist group, but he was basically responding to a letter from a union group of school board members that were highly politicized. That can happen. You can have that audit and censor if you have an empowered middle class. Second thing that's happened, we have lost control of our borders. And that sounds self-evident, but there is no such thing in America as federal immigration law. It's a construct. It's vanished. But historically, every people has needed a defined space. an area where they could inculcate customs, traditions, and the American experience, something like we all know the 4th of July. We're all on the same page about the Gettysburg Address. We have some idea about the Battle of the Bulge. We know something about the special relationship the United States holds with Britain, Canada, Australia, all of those elements that we share in common. But when you have no border, and you are bringing across 2 million people, and you have over 22 million people who are residing here illegally, on top of legal residents who are not citizens. And we have in California, 27% of the population was not born in the United States. It's very hard to assimilate, integrate, intermarry this population. We are one of the few countries, yours is another, that has experimented with something that's unknown in history, and that's a multiracial democracy. Anytime there was a multiracial state, whether it was in the Ottoman Empire or the former Yugoslavia or the Soviet Union, there had to be a level of coercion, capital punishment, killing, to force people to get along, and they usually eventually fail. But India can't do it very well. Brazil can't do it very well. It's a very fragile and tenuous proposition. And yet you can't even attempt it unless you have controlled borders, so you can take a breathing space and say, we're going to have legal immigrants only, which we would prefer have a high school diploma, a knowledge of English. They must come legally. We like diversity in their sources of their places of origin. We destroyed that. The third is that it's tangential to the second, and that is, if you have people of different ethnic backgrounds in a nation state, it's very important that everybody understands that your superficial appearance is incidental, not essential to who you are. In other words, we're not going to return back to pre-civilizational tribalism. We do not identify primarily by our ethnic and racial creed. That does not mean that Western societies are not enriched with fashion, food, music, literature from different cultures that immigrate to the country. Of course they are, but you don't tamper with the core of the Western legacy of constitutional government, free speech, freedom of religious expression, market capitalism, protection of private property, and independent judiciary. And you don't then regress to a nation, as Hobbes said, of everybody at war with everybody else. In other words, tribalism. And yet, what are we doing in the United States after May of last year? We have completely rejected the legacy of Martin Luther King Jr., that we're going to judge people by the content of their character and not the color of their skins. We're toppling statues at night. We're erasing people's names from buildings. We are canceling out figures of the past. We're taking down any reference to Woodrow Wilson or Thomas Jefferson. And most of the time we're doing it without a majority vote of a local council or a state commission. And so we're Jacobins, we're Bolsheviks, and we're trying to retribalize so that each group will be Latino first, American second or third, African American first, American second or third, Asian, Native American, gay, female. And at some point, and this is what's dangerous about it, 70% of the population is still what the marginalized, self-identified marginalized community identify themselves as white. They say that 70% of the country is white. If you continue this white supremacy, white privilege, we're going to hunt you out, critical race theory, you got to learn how you're responsible for all these ills, then that majority feels beleaguered. They already feel that crime is skyrocketing. They're pinched by high fuel prices, gas prices, standard of living, real wages, all going down. And to add on to that burden, that they're culpable from 1776, which doesn't exist supposedly more, it's 1619. And the country was toxic then, it's toxic now, it must be changed or it'll be toxic in the future. That's too much to ask. And what we're going to watch, I think, tragically, is a retribalization. People are going to say, if that group goes tribal and that group goes tribal and this group, then I'm going to go tribal. And I'm not going to apologize for the people who created a country that everybody who hates it seems to want to go. Representative Omar thinks that America is so terrible? Why did her parents leave Somalia? Why did the parents of AOC leave Puerto Rico? Why did Representative Tlaib's parents, that this is such a terrible place, why did they come from the West Bank? These are questions that are now being asked. But the combination of the economic erosion of the middle class, the absence of borders, and we have just fluid migrations in and out of the United States, and a retribalization has created this sense of crisis and the inability of people to hold their leaders responsible. But these are organic processes from the ground up. There were also other factors from the top down that diminished the power of the citizen to self-govern. And as we saw in 2020, 21, that became very evident when we entered these various stress tests. One of them is, I mentioned it earlier, these unelected, the deep state, the administrative state, the permanent government. These are people, as I said, that are not accountable. And what do I mean by not accountable? I mean that when James Comey was asked what was the role of the FBI in seeding the Steele dossier and false documents during the middle of a campaign to diminish the viability of one candidate, he said under oath to House investigatory committees 245 times, I don't remember. When Christopher Steele was asked to provide sources for his dossier, he had none. And when Robert Mueller, who spent 22 months, $40 million with a dream team, an all-star, a hunter-killer team of legal eagles, we were told, he was asked under oath, would you please explain how your investigation grew out of the dossier and Fusion GPS? He said, I have no idea what you're talking. I don't know anything about Fusion GPS. I know nothing about the dossier. He's either completely non-compos mentis or he was abjectly lying under oath. I could go on, but we have this cadre again that seems immune. And Merrick Garland's a good example. Nobody elected Merrick Garland to be Attorney General. He serves at the pleasure of the president. And when he says he's going to take the FBI and hunt out particular citizens without any investigation, without any evidence adduced, just because a powerful union who supports financially his president has asked him to, then you can see the citizen has lost the power to control its own bureaucracy. There's, who is going to police the police, as Juvenal once said. There's a second group from on top that are diminishing the ability of the citizen to ensure their freedoms. And that's, I guess we would call them the evolutionaries. Now, these are people who believe that human nature is constantly in a state of flux, that new technology, new diet, new therapeutic curricula, whatever the particular stimulus is, mankind is constantly progressing. Old literature, ancient philosophy, the wisdom and legacy of the ages, what our grandparents told us, none of that applies anymore. It's all irrelevant. And therefore, our 233-year-old Constitution is ossified, calcified. It is of no relevance. It was created by old white men, and therefore we have to get over it. So this year, as soon as the Biden vessel was floated into power and this agenda was, the cargo was unloaded, what did we see? Remember, there was no mandate. There was no huge supermajority in the Senate. It's 50-50. There was no huge margin that Barack Obama came in with in 2008 and lost in 2010. No, there was a very disputed, contentious election and razor-thin majorities. But nonetheless, the left said, who's going to stop us? We're going to try to get rid of the 233-year-old Electoral College, and we don't care what the founders said or what's in the Federalist Papers or the purpose of it. We don't like it. We lost the blue wall in 2016. It didn't work for us. We're going to get rid of the 150-year tradition of 9 justices on the Supreme Court. They're too conservative. We don't care whether FDR was ridiculed for trying it in 1937. We're going to do it right this time. They're one vote from getting that passed. We're going to get rid of this idea for 180 years is custom of a Senate filibuster. We used it all the time when we were in the minority. Nobody tried to abolish it. Now that we're in the majority, we're going to abolish it. We don't like the idea of 60 years, we've had 50 states. We need more senators. We need them right now. This is the moment. We've got to get this progressive agenda. We want Puerto Rico and the DC in. We're not going to go through the regular process of amendments and admissions. We're just going to ram it through on 51 votes in the Senate if we can. And we don't like this idea that's in the Constitution that says that the states have primary responsibilities in national election to set the ballot protocols. We're going to federalize all of these procedures in the way that we think is important, i.e., no one should have to have an ID to go to the polls. You can vote for 10 days. If you send in a mail ballot and you only have your first name, only your last name, no address, it doesn't matter. That's fine. If signature's wrong, doesn't matter. We're going to federalize that. And so you can see that this is the elite bookend to the organic end of borders. By that, I mean, if you cannot be confident in your message, then you either have to change the demography in a constitutional society, which they're doing, or you have to, from on top, change the rules by which you play, which they're doing. And finally, the citizen lost out. I know this is kind of a hackneyed phrase, but the citizen of the United States, and I think in general in the Western world, lost out with globalization. Well, I guess we could call it cosmopolitanism. That's another Greek word, the citizen of the world-ism. All of us at the millennium were thought, this globalization is going to do mankind a lot of good, because it's really a euphemism for Westernization, or maybe even North Americanization. The idea that free market capitalism and efficient productivity will allow people in Bolivia to have Cipro. And for the first time, people in Mongolia will have good glasses. And then it kind of became more ecumenical. Everybody was going to wear tie-dye shirts and wear jeans and flip-flops. And then with the onset of smartphones and iPads and computers and satellite dishes, then the world was going to be interlocked and interconnected. But we made two mistakes on it. The first is we kind of confuse cause and effect. It's true somewhat in Canada, but especially in the United States at the coast, the coastal areas, La Jolla to Seattle, or Boston to all the way down to Virginia, were areas, one looking out at the EU, the other at the vibrant Asian economies. And all of a sudden for that cadre, and this is after all where Caltech is, where Stanford is, where Berkeley is, where UCLA is, where Harvard is, where Yale is, where MIT is. This is where corporate headquarters are. This is where Wall Street is. This is where the capital is. This coastal culture then said, this is wonderful. The next step will be to interconnect our cultures and our economies, but also our politics. And what happened was that people in media, many of us that are listening to this, people who litigate, lawyers, insurers, capitalists, investors, academics, intellectuals, anybody who had unique skills that were not easily duplicated by the Chinese economy, or you needed them in Russia, or your Asian economies in Vietnam to the Philippines to South Korea, still needed people in the West for their particular skill set. They became fabulously successful. I know that when I used to write a column in the 90s, I would be very happy if somebody from Kansas wrote me a fan letter. It took about 5 days for a syndicated column to be, read in a newspaper, and it was a very small audience. And suddenly now when you write, you can get a letter almost an hour later from Uganda from a reader. So there's an enormous readership now. And people who have that market did very well. People in the middle of the country who relied on muscular labor, or traditional things like farming or mining or timber, anything that had anybody who was engaged with their muscles of building actual concrete things, or had a concrete natural resource that could be duplicated, were duplicated as outsourcing, offshoring, and Xeroxing of their labor and capital or their resources proceeded. And so we saw a vast diminishment in places like Ohio and southern Michigan, the Central Valley of California, anywhere outside the coast. And it was sort of a 50-50 proposition. 75% of the country was red and conservative and traditional and got hurt enormously by globalization. And regionally, the 25% represented half the population. So we were split 50-50. And the intellectual classes then said to the interior, confusing cause and effect, well, you lost out because you're losers, you're deplorables, you're clingers, you're irredeemables, you're dregs, you're domestic terrorists, you're scum. All of these words I'm quoting now were voiced by Barack Obama, Hillary Clinton, or Joe Biden, or John McCain said they were crazy. And so we, confusing cause and effect, we said that you lost out because you weren't up to it, or you were meth heads, or you were suicidal, so jobs left you and you lost out. With the exact opposite was it true. Their pathologies were reactions to this nuclear blast that hit the interior of the United States. And I say that because you could make the argument that the post-war commercial order was not symmetrical with the advent of China. So the United States was engaging in trade relationships that were not to the United States' benefit, or they were spending amounts of money on defense that countries otherwise did not have to invest in, or their universities were not keeping up with STEM cutting edge technologies and investments because they were undergoing a therapeutic emphasis. They were teaching people about equity or diversion or inclusion, but not necessarily physics and engineering and high tech. So what I'm getting at is that globalization then did a lot of damage and split the country in two. The second thing is our leaders then made this drastic mistake of confusing economic globalization and cultural globalization with political globalization. So during the Obama administration, for example, they felt that other countries were as wise as we were about the Iranian deal. And therefore, why would we follow this ossified idea that the US Senate had to approve a treaty by two-thirds vote? And why not just ram it through? And that's what they did. And when they could not get the people of America to approve of joining the Paris Climate Accord, they simply said they were going to be an honorific member or something, but they would abide by what the Climate Accord guidelines entail. In fact, we surpassed them, but only due to the use of natural gas. Or they said, as Tony Blinken just did, we need guidance about our innate racism. We would like the United Nations members to come in and adjudicate whether the United States is racist or not, even though some of them, of course, like China, have 1 million people in forced labor camps. Or we said the International Criminal Court had a right to survey, censor, audit what Americans were doing in Afghanistan and Iraq, even though none of those societies or countries or nations were consensual. We have about 190 countries in the world, and only about 45% can, by the straining the imagination, be called constitutional. So the idea that you would give up your sovereignty, in a sense, that's what you would gravitate to, world government, would be absurd. And yet that's what's happening again. And it's emasculating the idea of a strong middle-class citizen within definable borders who are united by their class and not their race, and have control over the bureaucracy. There's sort of Versailles-like community that runs the United States is subject to the citizens, not vice versa. And they have confidence to say the Constitution was a rare document. Human nature does not change. You may think it does, but it's innately stable. And this Constitution was almost perfect at its inception. It has an amendment process that we follow, but we're not going to scrap it in the 233rd year. And you're absurd if you think we're going to surrender what our forefathers won at Normandy Beach or at Gettysburg or at Valley Forge over to an international consortium, maybe the Great Reset Group at Davos or some sort of self-appointed international group of financial and corporate grandees. We're not going to do that. And so it was this loss of an empowered middle class that led to a lack of political audit and empowerment of people who were not elected. And a very rare event, I think, in North American history, but also in the United States history, where power was seized by a small group of Jacobins. These are not Democrats, these are not progressives, these are Jacobins. These are hard left socialists. And given the bad 15 months between 2020 and 21 and the diminishment of the autonomy and power of the middle class, we have people in power who, riding the horse of Joe Biden, mute and deaf though you could metaphorically argue that he was, they now know that their policies are unpopular, that they're going to face a reckoning in the midterm in which they will lose the House and probably the Senate. And they understand that they have poked the sleeping citizen for so long, and they have changed names of streets and toppled statues and called in the FBI on them and had all of these adjectives of deprecation. So what am I getting at? There's going to be a reaction. And I think it's going to be just a matter of magnitude, not if and not when. It's going to happen. We know it's going to be very soon in the midterms. And I think you're going to see the greatest outrage that we've seen. And I hope it leads to the resurgence and the rebirth of a viable, active, and powerful middle class that's kept this country viable for 233 years. And with that, I'll finish. Thank you very much for listening